Hello. We'll talk about advertising. It'll be a sort of continuation from Jill's talk. Just to start with, just a fact. But this is based on a huge amount of analytical work that Ebiquity conducted, and we're doing collaboration with ThinkBox in terms of aggregating those results. I'll show you some of the results later. But if you look at the media channel optimization, i.e. where spend has been put by less efficient channels and you can optimize it to create a better picture, then you get a picture of Slovenia, and we reckon just on 3 categories, then the upside of that is about 45 billion. We're dealing with absolutely huge numbers here, and actually understanding it, understanding the metrics around it, there's a big profit gain to be achieved. If you say the allocation, right-sizing the allocation, so it's 450 million in the UK. Just to introduce Ebiquity first, I'm actually generally aware of what we do. Obviously, we do the auditing, we do the sort of dating game between advertisers and agencies, agency selection, a lot of tech advice. We do a huge amount of modeling and effectiveness projects on which these insights are based. The key thing, though, is that we're independent. We have no vested interest whatsoever other than working for our clients and getting the best and most profitable outcome to our clients. So all of the comments I'll be made is from that independent standpoint. I think, say, not that we were colluding before, but the big global challenge at the moment in advertising, as well as sort of digital, analog, is this short-termism that is more prevalent, and you've seen the charts there of the shift in spend in Jill's presentation. There's a number of reasons for this. As I say, Jill talked to a lot of them. Obviously, the consumer dynamics and the corporate pressure. It's interesting, we talk and work with a number of different clients in the same sector. So you might be talking with one auto client, and they're saying, well, actually, we haven't done any modeling work before, but we assume that all of our competitors do, and they're doing work, and they're shifting their spend into these channels. Then you go and talk to some of their competitors, and they say exactly the same thing about all their other competitors. So they're sort of following the herd mentality. It certainly in some sectors really is quite prevalent. Companies are certainly investing in data-driven channels. But the key thing, and I say this as a sort of member of the measurement community, and I'll talk about this more in a moment, is that the measurement frameworks that we have to look at short-term responses and long-term responses fundamentally are highly flawed. You're not well served as an advertising community by the measurement techniques, or at least generally how they are applied in the industry. There is the capability to apply it correctly. So let's move on from that. Again, this perspective about the time in which advertising impacts sales, or whether it's sort of quotes, perhaps generation, if you're in direct line, as Sam will be talking later. Generally, the perspective is hours and days, the very short term, and that's kind of what you're picking up in attribution models, digital attribution models, actually is a small element. If you're looking at sort of weeks and months, which really is the domain of most mixed models, most econometric models, where they have their ad stock functions, you're generally talking 3 or 4 months in those models to pick up those effects. But the long term actually is significantly bigger than that. So even if you're doing mixed models in the industry, then 95% of those mixed models is actually not giving you the right perspective on, sort of brand building versus sort of conversion and more short-term messaging that you're putting out. Okay, there is a natural bias actually in those key elements of the measurement framework. So we've got a situation that advertisers are moving to the direct and sell. We're certainly finding, I think there's a font change there, but effectiveness is falling. And say, echoing what Jill said, the long-term health of brands has been put at risk. It's been well written. I'm sure most of you have read the work with Les Bennett and Peter Field. But the proof is that as you move from real time to deal time, the advertising effectiveness is falling. They've reviewed all of the IPA submissions through time. And this is the net effect, and to a large degree corresponding with significant increases in short-term and digitally used communications over that time. So there is a lot of distraction, and I think, come back to the media metrics, there's a lot of things sort of obscuring the situation. If you think about the way perhaps that Facebook now sell their inventory, and you compare it perhaps with TV, if you look at the cost per thousand difference, it actually comes in a little below even all adult cost per thousands for TVRs. But that's per impression served. So if you follow the route through, then if you get to valid and viewable, audible, get to the end of audible and completed, the actual cost of reach for Facebook or YouTube is significantly different and skewed. It is massively more expensive to have the sort of full consumer experience versus TV when you look at it in that way. And there's a lot of misleading comments from the tech giants that, again, ultimately from the results of all of the models that we're running at Ebiquity, I think are highly misleading. So quotes from Google, brands should spend 24% of their ad budgets on YouTube. I can categorically say in the hundreds of models that we've run at Ebiquity, we've never had that answer. It is completely misleading. I don't know if Google are in the audience. I might get beat up on the way out, but Facebook, it's kind of like we've got this massive reach on, you've got the Super Bowl every day. Again, the reach of Facebook does not compare with TV in no shape or form. And again, saying that YouTube generates better ROIs than TV. It's not to say that they can't. Actually, in small spends, you can see very efficient responses on YouTube, but it's generally actually re-airing the most distinctive assets from the sort of TV advertising through YouTube. But generally, as soon as you start to spend a lot of money and increase the percentage of YouTube as part of the overall ad spend, because the reach saturates so quickly, it becomes very inefficient very quickly. So, all of those sort of famous quotes about knowing which half your advertising budget is working, the reality now is that with modern techniques, the data availability that exists, you can measure everything. You can measure everything properly. It's not always measured properly, but you can measure everything properly. So moving to an effectiveness-led media plan is perfectly possible in this day and age. It's sometimes tricky, I think, for clients, for advertisers, and I think for agency folk as well, where I used to work, to get their mind sometimes around return on investment. If you use the sort of traditional accountancy version, which is the incremental, sort of sales and profit that you generated divided by the cost, it doesn't always make it that easy to sort of do mental comparisons in your mind between the different media channels. I think sometimes it's a lot easier to think of it in terms of this. So if you, the lighter blue there, so fundamentally if you talk about ROI, it's a function of the cost of reach, getting your message out there, times by the effectiveness per reach point. So if you went back to that comparison, say between sort of Facebook and the different metrics, actually the effectiveness per reach point, once you've seen it or if you have seen it, is fundamental in that equation. So if the experience is low, obviously the lift on sales is going to be low, and those channels will be significantly disadvantaged. And again, I kind of think if you stand back from this situation, then looking at TV versus other channels, for the majority of advertising tasks, and certainly not all advertising tasks, I should caveat, is there's so much in the favor of TV that in terms of viewability, no fraud issues, extremely low CPM. I would expect, just doing the mental maths myself of how it works, that it should be sitting on top of the pile in terms of ROI. At the risk of offending half the audience, which I know from agencies, but I think sometimes the perception of how these things work in terms of the perspective, the number of presentations that I would see sort of promoting digital channels, saying that advertising is dead or dying. I've seen tens and tens from many agencies promoting that view, but it simply isn't the case. We know there are declines, and we know actually how TV has been digested is changing. We've had a lot of presentations about that this morning. But in terms of where people see advertising they like, you can see if you just look at the bottom two in terms of social and TV as a comparison between normal people in Adland, it's absolutely skewed in an opposite direction to the reality. And it's almost like we are living in our own bubble that doesn't see how the majority of the population actually consume the advertising or watch TV or look at social. I won't talk to this because we know CMOs, they are short-lived, and Jill was talking about that. But what it does mean is that in terms of digital metrics that are churned out from digital media, the willingness to grasp at those numbers to prove the effect is enormous. It is, I think it's Mark Evans at DLG used the phrase, it's like methamphetamines for marketers. So, you know, there are the numbers there to prove the short-term impact. But the issue with digital attribution, it is like a scene from Finding Nemo. Because you are, one, only looking at the digital space, so if you're a retailer and you're selling 90%, you know, on the shopping street and 10% online, you're only looking at a very partial measure. And you are 100% attributing to a digital touchpoint. It is completely blind in most of the digital attribution models there as to accrediting to other factors. Either they would have sold the base sales level, seasonality, weather, you know, analog media and the rest. So there is a massive overstatement of the efficiency of digital media when you use digital attribution in isolation. There is what is generally called the unified model. If you look at sort of Forrester or such like, that's what they will describe, of tying up econometric modeling, which is on the left there, versus attribution modeling, digital attribution modeling. So what the econometric modeling would do is to scale all of the key factors, the marketing levers, competition, all the rest of it, so that you can get a scaling of what digital media is correctly in that context. So if you sort of eyeball that chart, if digital media is accounting for 20% of sales, then based on the ROIs that you would get from the digital attribution model, divide them by 5 crudely. It's a little more complex than that, but fundamentally that's what you're doing, divide them by 5, and you would get comparable metrics then between broadcast media and digital media. So if you put them together in that way, it's possible to look at it. And again, if you apply that methodology, this is some work we did in the States for a major airline. Actually, rather helpfully or unhelpfully, we've got cost per acquisition rather than ROI, but we know how those metrics work. The point is, if you look at the difference between TV, which under the old analysis was looking at very expensive to acquire customers, i.e. very low ROI, and then if you look under the correctly done by putting mixed modeling together with digital attribution, you know, there is a massive change in the pecking order of where you would spend the money. The final thing to say, and talking again about the long term, I've already stated that most mixed modeling is not really capturing the long term properly. So typically, if you've got a sort of pie chart of sort of total sales attribution from, so top left here from the econometric modeling, then certainly for healthy brands, it's actually the base sales that is the most predominant part. So i.e. if you stopped your media, that's what you would have for that year. The key challenge actually is understanding what drives the long term, what drives the base, and actually doing the modeling of the base, understanding the sort of brand metrics and which campaigns are impacting the brand metrics that actually impacts the long-term baseline. You've then got some of the creative recipe and some of the knowledge about the content, because fundamentally when you're talking about channel and content, you look at all the IPA papers, if you look at the balance between those, it is the content that will shift the trajectory of the brand. It is not the channel. Obviously the content needs to be on the right channel for it to be effective, but actually understanding the content and what drives the long term is the sort of new frontier. Now, we've been doing a lot of modeling. Just to highlight some of these, you'll have seen some of these figures through the ThinkBox presentations, more often than not presented by my colleague Nick Pugh. what that work is doing, and this is covering about 2,000 models, we're updating this work. They're effectively, or ThinkBox are seeing our aggregated results from all of the individual models that we've databased for our client base in the effectiveness department. And this for the UK is what it shows. So in terms of, and these are from the econometric models looking at the sort of 3 to 4 months after the deployment of advertising. Okay, I'll come on to the long term in a moment. So it's certainly saying that actually it's all of the analog channels. So TV, top of the pile. There's more detail if you go onto the ThinkBox site to look at this by industry vertical. We're certainly finding generally people from the out-of-home industry don't like econometricians, I'm well aware, but we consistently across the agencies find this. But online display, and to a degree online video, some way down in terms of efficiency overall. We've collaborated actually with Game Theory, which is, again, another econometrics agency, part of the WPP group, formerly OHAL. And we also modeled the long term. So if the previous slides were looking at the short term impact, i.e. defined as a few months after deployment, this is looking at the long term. And what we can see is actually that TV really rules the roost when you take the long term into account. It's justified there in the short term. Effectively, what this means, if we're doing sort of global work for a FMCG client at the moment, if you look at the optimization just from the general mix models, it would say put 80 to 85% of their spend into TV. If you take the long term into account, it'd actually be 90, closer to 95% of their spend into TV, and that's the difference it makes. So, again, finishing off on that, looking at all of the sort of body of modeling work that we were doing and building the optimizations with these channel differences taken into account, then over finance, FMCG, and retail, those are the recommended increases as an average in terms of increase in TV spending as a result of that work. And that would generate about 450 million in growth in profit, so huge numbers when you get that balance right. Last couple of charts, just say if there's people outside of the UK here, we've done a lot of modelling work in different countries. We were speaking at the Mediatel event in Canada, and certainly our results from Canada bear out a very similar sort of pecking order to what we've seen on the ThinkBox stuff in the UK. This is a big study that they called Think TV, or the Payback Study in Australia, where we did all of the modelling for it. That's the spec of it. And on the right-hand side is sort of indexed versus TV. That was the efficiency. So it was even more stark in Australia than actually it was or currently is in the UK. But it's a picture that's replicated in all of the countries and continents where we do modelling work. And say, to estimate the global profit, that's going back to that big number at the beginning. If you optimise it in terms of the channel choices, that's where you get your 45 billion, which I say ultimately is a huge, huge number of profit gain if we get this right and put the science and the right measurement behind these key decisions. And that is the same as the GDP of Norway, to put it in perspective. Someone did say to me the other day that actually not many people live in Norway, but I did remind them there's a shed load of oil that they actually trade through that country, so it's certainly a very big number. Okay, and that's where we finish. Thank you.
Right, we've got time for just one question. If anybody's got a question out there. There are the lights. Anyone want to ask Mike anything? Yeah, very handily, right in the middle of the middle. Gentleman in the white shirt.
Hi, Johnny Appleby from Wavemaker. You had online video as a separate category from TV, yet with so much VOD now consumed on the TV set and from a user experience perspective, very much the same as TV. How does your analysis account for that from a consumer experience perspective?
Yeah, there was a reason why in the ThinkBox work, that whereas all of the other media channels we had literally tens and hundreds of sample points, there was less sample points to split out effectively VOD in its sort of different components. We have done that for individual clients, but that's why we put it all together. And effectively it does vary. It is very much linked to the content. We can sometimes see it be more effective than linear TV. Generally, as an average, most of those channels are a little lower, but it certainly can work. I think that's when you get the sort of, the devil's in the detail and actually understand what content on what discrete channels is the way to go. Does that make sense?
Happy with that? Good. Right. Thank you very much indeed then to Mike Campbell.
Okay.
Thank you.